Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. The OPEC Plus has announced that it will increase oil production by 548,000 barrels per day starting in August, exceeding expectation. The move aims to stabilize prices and regain a market share amid slowing demand. Now, with oil revenue playing a key role in funding Russia's war in Ukraine, this decision could shift the economic dynamics of the conflict. Joining us on TVP World to assess the strategic fallout is Mark Katz, professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So can you help us break down what are the likely short-term effect of this production increase when it comes to global oil prices?
Well, I think obviously the more oil that's being produced, presumably this will serve to lower the price of oil, and that's obviously not in Russia's interests. But yet, nevertheless, OPEC Plus is going forward with this decision.
To what extent is this decision made by market forces versus, be it like geopolitical calculations?
You know, I think it has a lot to do with the internal dynamics of OPEC Plus itself. You know, one of the things that really annoys the Saudis is that there are some oil-producing countries that exceed their quota, and reportedly, both Iraq and Kazakhstan are producing more than their OPEC Plus quota is allowed for. And so by the Saudis, increasing their own production, this serves to lower the price that everyone can get. The other factor is that it's rumored that the United Arab Emirates in particular is very unhappy about the quota that it has, and that it's even considering leaving OPEC altogether, and having no constraints on its production. Therefore, I think that both Saudi Arabia and Russia, they prefer to have an agreed upon increase in production, even though it lowers the price of oil that they receive, because if the UAE leaves OPEC Plus, then there'll be an even lower price still for everyone. And so I think this is partly being done to appease the United Arab Emirates.
All right, there's a lot of interesting dynamic at play here, and like you mentioned, it mostly has to do with the internal workings of OPEC Plus. But can you help us unpack how this the whole thing operates and how like you mentioned, the overproduction of countries like Iraq and Kazakhstan kind of affect the interests of other countries. So how does it come to be that by increasing production by the Saudis, by Russia, which that would bring the price down? How does that work to their interest?
Well, Saudi Arabia has done this repeatedly over the past few decades. They are known as the swing producer. In other words, that they're rich enough that they can either produce more or produce less. And even if they produce less, they still have an awful lot of money. Whereas most oil producers, they basically have an interest in producing just as much as they possibly can. But essentially, to limit Saudi oil production, they have limited their own. Now, what's happened in the past is that either some OPEC members have cheated and have produced more than they said they would, or non-OPEC members have been producing more, and that with the Saudis' polite requests for them to produce less have gone unheeded. And so what the Saudis, what their standard reaction is to ramp up production. And they can do this because their costs of production are much lower than pretty much everybody else's. In other words, they can make a profit at a lower price, unlike many countries where, if the price comes down, their costs of production are higher, and so either their profits are going to be less or they're quite simply going to experience a loss.
So essentially, it's Saudis trying to price out the competition. Now, like you mentioned, this probably doesn't bode well for Russia. However, they do seem to be on board as well. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov even came out and said they agree with this move. Are they just putting on a tough face, or are there any more calculations behind that?
Well, back I think it was in 2016. I forget exactly when this happened. Maybe it was 2020. But in any event, there had been, Russia had never abided by any kind of OPEC quota before, and had, the Saudis were ramping up production, hurting their interest. And then suddenly the Russians decided that they would cooperate with the Saudis in this new OPEC plus format. But I believe, now that I recall, it was in 2020 when the Saudis wanted to continue limiting production, that the Russians decided that they didn't have to. And the logic was that their expenditures were such that they could tolerate a lower oil price than the Saudis could, and the Saudis would just have to accept it. Well, the Saudis didn't, and their reaction was to massively start producing oil, so much so that the Russian oil it had to be sold at a loss, and in other countries as well, whereas the Saudis could still make some money, and essentially the Russians backed down very quickly. So the lesson they learned is that you do not go against the Saudis when it comes to the oil market. That Russia is obviously a much bigger country than Saudi Arabia, but in the oil sphere, Saudi Arabia is the superpower. Even though, of course, Saudi Arabia, Russia, the United States, they're all producing, very, very high levels of oil, more or less, well above 10 million barrels a day, or they certainly can. But the difference, of course, is that Saudi Arabia doesn't have to do it, whereas the Russians, do. They do need this income, and so the Russians were taught a lesson which they haven't forgotten. And so I think that for the Russians, what they understand is that it's better to cooperate with the Saudis, even though this may mean that for a time, they get a lower oil price. Now, typically what happens when the Saudis do this sort of thing is that it's not forever. In other words, at a certain point, we know that the target states who are annoying the Saudis, overproducing, in this case Kazakhstan and Iraq, that at a certain point they will, as the Americans say, cry uncle. They'll give up and they'll do what the Saudis want. Now that may happen again, but I think the real hard thing for the Saudis on this occasion is would the United Arab Emirates do this? In other words, this is a very rich country. Like the Saudis, they don't need to produce that much to earn. In other words, their cost of production are pretty low as well. And so I think for the Saudis, they're part of the reason why they're increasing production on this occasion is to give more of a quota to the UAE. So it's sort of different states have different purposes. In other words, that the Kazakhs and the Iraqis are trying to produce an awful lot, and but they these are states that really need the money. The UAE has a lot more independence in the oil market, and so if they pull out of OPEC, then this is going to mean even greater production still. Iraq and Kazakhstan will also be hurt, along with Russia, Saudi Arabia, and everybody else. So I think that it's a question of letting the UAE have a bigger quota, even though this hurts everyone's oil price.
All right, so this does help us paint a better picture of how it functions. Thanks so much. Now, I would like to draw our attention back to Russia because, well, this, of course, everyone's looking forward to whether or not this will impact Russia's war coffer. Do you think this move by OPEC Plus will kind of interact with Western sanctions on Russian energy export in any kind of way?
It doesn't help Russia, that's for sure. In other words, it means that the same amount of production by Russia is going to get less money, or even if Russia manages to increase production. The trouble for the Russians is that because their oil is under sanction, there are those who will not buy it, and those who do buy it can buy it at a lower price. So an overall lower price for the world market price of oil, well, the Russians are getting less than that still. The various estimates of the discount, sometimes it might even disappear, but basically they're not getting as much per barrel as everybody else. So it certainly doesn't help the Russians, that's for sure. Now, of course, they managed to do quite a bit with a little. It's not clear that this is going to end Vladimir Putin's war effort. In fact, I would think that it's not. But when you add this to the other problems that Russia is experiencing in terms of high inflation, shortage of workers, and obviously the need to pay for the war effort. They're paying lots of bonuses to people for recruitment purposes. That this obviously a lower oil price does not help, and one just wonders how long they can go on. I think we're obviously in a very desperate position in this war. I think that both the Russians are under terrible strains. Ukraine certainly is under terrible strain. And this move by OPEC Plus, even though the Russians are going along with it, obviously does not help Russia.
All right. Last but not least, the EU recently just got together and set a new climate target. Do you think that there is also a risk where cheaper oil would actually reduce kind of the urgency for alternative energy investments or diversification?
Well, it certainly does. In other words, it's obviously everyone wants to improve the climate, but that's sort of it's not anyone's sort of primary goal. I mean, maybe it should be, maybe it is for some, but for a lot of countries, it's nice to work for something to 10, 20 years down the road. But right now, getting cheaper oil, that's obviously very beneficial. And with a lower oil price, that obviously means that investment in alternatives is going to be difficult. In other words, it's better for alternatives if the oil price is high. That makes alternatives more competitive. But with a lower oil price, that works the other way.
All right. Thank you so much for your input and insight and helping us break all of that down. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.